Hello and welcome everyone to the Tower Project. Today I've got a very special video for you. We're going to be talking about armor and armor piercing and missile attack and melee attack and how all these things play together. And I wanted to tackle this because there's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of wrong ways that people look at this, and I just wanted to put everything on the table, clarify everything, and show you guys how all these stats work together so you can be a better player, get better engagements, get better results both in campaign and multiplayer. So let's dive right into the video here. So the first thing I'm going to start off with is going over unit stats and how these work. So let's open the tooltip here on the dismounted feudal knights. So I want to primarily look at the defense here. So you'll see right here there's a line total defense. Now this feudal knight unit has a total defense of 21. However, that total defense stat is broken up from three subfactors: the armor value, the defensive skill, and the shield. And these three defensive stats play different roles in different engagements. So let's go over these one by one. Let's start with the defensive skill. So a unit like feudal knights has a really high defensive skill as opposed to something like a Pavis crossbowman. You'll notice they have an 8 defensive skill. Pavis crossbowmen have 3. The reason for this is because defensive skill only applies in melee combat. And dismounted feudal knights are obviously a melee unit, so they're going to have a higher defensive skill because you're going to want them to survive longer and be more effective in melee. So again, the defensive skill only applies in melee. So if these knights are getting shot by anything, any type of missile unit, they immediately lose that 8 defense skill. So for example, if this Venetian archers with a missile attack of 9 was shooting these feudal knights straight in the face, they would lose the defensive skill, but they would still have the shield and the armor. So they would have a total defense of 13 against that 9 missile damage, not 21. So that's why with a lot of different units, like for example this Venetian heavy infantry, they only have 3 defensive skill. Most of their defense is in their armor and their shield. So they're actually going to have the same defense against missile fire as those feudal knights will, even though their defense is visibly 5 points lower. That the reason for that 5-point discrepancy is only that the Venetian heavy infantry have a less defensive skill because they're not trained knights. They're just normal people of the peasant, of the artisan class that have signed up to fight for Venice. So they don't have the same defensive skill that a trained knight would. So that's the defensive skill tooltip. Now let's look at the shield tooltip. Here's one that there are quite a few misconceptions on how the shield plays out. One of the biggest misconceptions is people think that shooting a unit from the quote-unquote non-shielded side will ignore their effect, i.e. this flank. If you are shooting the Venetian heavy infantry from the flank where they do not have their shield, a lot of people think that that will ignore the shield defense. That is a misconception. Let me explain to you how the shield works. So the shield, let's just take these Venetian heavy infantry for example. They have a shield stat of 6. Now, the shield will always give full frontal protection. What do I mean by that? If these Venetian heavy infantry are being attacked via melee in the front, or they're being shot in the front, that shield is going to provide the full 6 protection. However, if they're being attacked on either flank, or shot on either flank, that shield is only going to provide half protection. So, if, again, this Venetian archer were shooting this Venetian infantry on either of its flanks, what would their total defense be? Well, remember, they lose the defensive skill, so it goes from 16 to 13, and if it's on the flank, they would also lose half of that shield. So now their total defense is only 10 against the 9 missile damage of the Venetian archers. Now, what if they were getting shot in the back? Well, the shield provides absolutely no protection. So if those archers were instead shooting these Venetian heavy infantry in the back, well, now they completely lose the shield. Their defense would only be their 7 armor. So, recap of what we covered up to this point, because we're going to get through a lot of this kind of meaty discussion. Defensive skill only applies in melee. Shield only provides its full defense from the front, both missile and melee, provides half protection on either flank, and no protection at the back. That leaves armor. So let's talk about armor. Another misconception with armor is that different types of armor present more durable or less durable armor. Like the 7 armor stat of these Feudal Knights, because it's chainmail, it's not going to provide the same defense as the 7 this Brigandine armor, but the plate armor in the picture here. Well, the 7 armor of the Venetian heavy infantry, even if it's Brigandine or plate armor, provides the exact same amount of defense as the 7-point chainmail armor on these Feudal Knights. It doesn't matter what kind of armor it is. It only matters what the armor stat is. So even if these guys looked like these musketeers and had visually no armor, but still had a 7 armor stat, they would still have the exact same protection. So let's talk about what the armor stat actually does. So the 7 armor on these Venetian heavy infantry, armor is the only thing that provides 360 protection. Whether you're being shot or you're being attacked, whether it happens in the front, the sides, or the back, the armor stat is still the same. So if you were shooting these Venetian heavy infantry in the back, they would still get the full 7 armor bonus. Now, that's all they would get, because they wouldn't get the defensive skill because it's missiles, and they wouldn't get the shield because it's in the flank. So their total defense would be 7, but they would still get the full armor stat. And this is true even for units that appear to have weaker armor on the back. Like, you'll remember if you upgraded these Feudal Knights, they'd get that breastplate on the front, but they'd still have mail on the back. That doesn't mean that they somehow have better protection from the front and worse on the back. It's just based on the stat there, and armor provides a 360-degree protection. Okay, so now that we've covered armor, let's talk about armor piercing, since we have these lovely Venetian heavy infantry here. Now, armor piercing is another thing there's a lot of misconceptions about. A lot of people think there's different levels of armor piercing, like some units have more armor piercing than others. Completely not true. If a unit has the effective against armor trait, it is, quote, armor piercing. What does that mean? Well, whether it's a handgunner unit that has effective against armor, or an arquebus, or a musket, or a warhammer, or a mace, or the hammers that the longbowmen have, or whatever type of weapon it is, missile or melee, if it has the effective against armor trait, it ignores half of the opponent's armor value. That is all it does. Let me rephrase that. Ignores half of the opponent's armor value. It doesn't matter what type of attack it is, how high of an attack it is, or how low of an attack it is. It ignores half of the opponent's armor. So, if this Feudal Knight was being attacked by the Venetian heavy infantry in the front, they would still get the full defensive skill because it's melee combat. They would still get the full shield bonus because it's being from the front, but their armor would be halved. So they would end up with 17.5 defense as opposed to 21, because they would lose 3.5 from the armor because their armor would be halved. So that's what armor piercing does. And again, it doesn't matter if it's the warhammers of the Venetian heavy infantry or if it was this Pavis crossbowman firing at them, it would still ignore half of the opponent's armor. Now, there is one caveat to the effective against armor trait, and that is with muskets. Now, the aforementioned misconception that there are various levels of armor piercing is primarily proponed by the different types of gunpowder units, because in the game descriptions on units, it'll say to the effect that handgunners can cause morale damage, but they don't really penetrate much armor. And then if you look at an arquebus description, it'll say arquebuses can penetrate most armors. And then if you'll look at the muskets, it'll say muskets can penetrate all armors. Now, that is very misleading to the player, because it doesn't matter if it's coming from the handgun or from the musket, the armor piercing effect is the same. These guys ignore half the armor, these guys ignore half the armor. The reason muskets are more effective is, number one, because of the range, number two, because they have a higher missile attack, and number 3 because they have a much, much higher accuracy. But let me explain to you the one caveat that there is with gunpowder and why gunpowder can be so brutally effective in this game. Let me start doing that by giving you kind of a 3-tier comparison of missile units and missile damage. So let's take this Venetian heavy infantry here, and let's assume the Venetian archers are shooting them from the front. What would the stats look like? Well, you have the 9 missile damage of the Venetian archers. Now, it would ignore the 3 defensive skills, so they're down to 13, but they would still get the shield and the armor. So it would be 9 missile attack against 13 defense on the Venetian heavy infantry. All right, well, let's say now it's the Pavis crossbowmen doing the exact same thing. So now you have a 12 missile attack. They don't get the defensive skill down to 13, but they also ignore half the armor because it's an armor-piercing damage. So now they only get the 6 shield plus 3.5 armor, so they're up to 10.5 defense instead of 16. So the Pavis crossbowmen are even more effective than the Venetian archers. But what if a musket unit was shooting that Venetian heavy infantry? Well, muskets have the lovely little effect of ignoring shields. That's right. All gunpowder units, whether it's riders, camel gunners, handgunners, arquebus, Portuguese arquebusier, Janissary musketeers, Cossack musketeers, regular musketeers, whatever musket unit, all of them ignore shields. Now, it doesn't say it here on the tooltip, but if you actually look in the game files and you look at the faction and unit stat tables, all gunpowder units completely ignore shields. So remember, this Venetian heavy infantry had a 13 defense against the Venetian archers, 10.5 against the Pavis crossbowmen. What would they have against a musket volley? Well, you'll lose the defensive skill, so they're down to 13. You lose the entire shield, so now they're down to 7. But remember, gunpowder units are effective against armor too, which means this 16 defense Venetian heavy infantry would have a 3.5 defense stat against muskets. It would take them all the way down to 3.5 defense. And it wouldn't matter if they were shooting them in the flank or in the back. They would have 3.5 defense and a 360 circle around the entire unit. Now let's compare that, startlingly, with this Feudal Knight unit. So same thing, they lose all the defensive skill. They lose all the shield, which takes them down to the 7 armor, which is armor piercing. So now we only have a 3.5 defense, which means this 21 total defense Feudal Knight has the exact same resiliency to musket fire as the 16 defense Venetian heavy infantry. Now, I'm going to do a follow-up video on this about understanding late period units and late period cavalry and shieldless units in general. But that's why you tend to see a lot of late period units like these Venetian heavy archers, or like the Aventuros for Portugal, or like the Swiss Guard, the Obudshire, Gothic Knights, the French Lancers. A lot of these late period units start to lose their shields. A big reason is because they might as well not have them, because muskets and all types of gunpowder completely ignore the shield stat. So just like you saw there, both the 16 defense Venetian heavy infantry and the 21 defense Feudal Knight have the exact same armor, have the exact same missile resistance to musket fire as one another. And it's only 3.5, which is why muskets can be so devastating. Now, they're partially nerfed in the fact, even if you spread them 2 ranks deep like that, where they're spread out as possible, you only have 24 muskets firing. And let's say you have a really good volley and 50% of those muskets hit the target. Okay, well now you have 12 musket balls hit the target, and you'll usually drop about 5 or 6 Venetian heavy infantry with 1 musket volley. The reason you get such good damage is because, and the reason a lot of people feel like muskets must be sniper rifles, is because almost every musket ball that hits is going to be a kill shot, or almost 50% at least, because they only have 3.5 defense against a 14 damage attack. So it's going to be the same thing as like a peasant getting shot by the Venetian archers. You know, a peasant that has 1 damage getting shot by a 5 or 6 damage missile unit, it's going to be the same ratio as a almost with a, you know, a 3.5 armor getting shot by 14. So that's why gunpowder units can be so devastating. And again, it doesn't matter if it's shot from musket, handgun, arquebus, the camel gunner gun, the rider gun, it's all the same. And so let's just do a very quick recap as we go ahead and start to close this video out of how armor and armor piercing stats work. Now, of course, non-armor piercing attacks, like the 13 damage of this feudal knight, it would have to get through the 6 shield, the 3 defense, and the 7 armor of the Venetian heavy infantry. So they would have to take on the entire 16 defense. But the Venetian warhammer is going to ignore half of the armor of the feudal knight. The crossbow, whether it's a missile weapon, it does the exact same thing. Muskets ignore the shield value. All missile damage ignores the defensive skill. Shields provide full protection from the front, half protection from the flank, no protection from the rear. And armor provides the same protection in a 360-degree angle. So I hope that this has been informative to you in helping to understand how all these units work, how the stats play out. And to close out, I just want to give some very brief examples of how this can be well utilized in multiplayer. A lot of people think that taking musket fire from the front will somehow reduce the damage they take from musket fire. That's not the case. If you're getting shot by muskets, it doesn't matter if it's in the flank, the front, or the back, you're going to take the same amount of damage, because the only applicable defensive trait that you're getting is your armor, which gives you the same defense all the way around the unit, because they ignore your shield and they ignore your defensive skill. So if you're getting shot by muskets, you need to just get out of there, because whether you're getting shot in the front or the back isn't going to make a difference on the amount of damage you take. Now, if you're using Pavis crossbowmen, armor-piercing units are going to be exponentially more effective against units that have higher armor. And so a unit that has a really high defensive skill like a feudal knight isn't going to be as affected. Well, defensive skill doesn't matter against the crossbows, but something like a feudal knight versus a Venetian heavy infantry, well, so much of the feudal knight's defense is based on its defensive skill, it's not going to be as heavily affected as something like a dismounted men-at-arms or a dismounted broken lancer, where they have much less defensive skill but higher armor. And so armor-piercing units, the more a unit's defense is based in their armor, the more effective an armor-piercing unit can be. But like a Venetian heavy infantry versus something like a Gallo-Glike or a woodsman unit, where they don't have any armor anyway, they're not that effective against armor trait, is going to be negated, and a feudal knight would be much more effective against those. Now, of course, a Venetian heavy infantry will still kill those units, but you're not going to be utilizing that unit as well. Now, the Pavis crossbow militia are going to be more devastating against units without shields, because they're going to ignore the defensive skill and they're going to ignore half the armor. And so if the unit doesn't have a shield, it's going to get devastated by armor-piercing missiles. And of course, gunpowder units, you can pretty much shoot whatever you want from whatever angle you want, and it's going to be extremely effective. So if there's anything to take away from this video, use gunpowder units, because they basically negate 90% of a unit's defense. And armor-piercing missile units are devastating against units without shields. They're devastating from the sides and the rears, where the shields do less damage. And effective against armor units are going to be exponentially more effective against units with higher armor values, because they're going to cut the armor, the total defense skill, more dramatically by cutting the armor in half. So I hope in this short video I've given you guys some good information. I've given you guys some good ideas on building your armies, how to use armies a little bit more effectively, get better engagements, and understanding how your units are going to take and receive damage a little bit better, so you can put them in better situations to get better results. That's what we're all about here at the Tower Project, serving the Total War community, helping you guys to be better players. I hope we've done that in this video. Please keep checking us out. See you guys back next time. like, subscribe. I appreciate you guys' support so much. We'll see you guys tomorrow with an all-new video on the Tower Project.